Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm Karen Blum, the Health Beat Leader for Health Information Technology for the Association of Healthcare Journalists. AHCJ is the largest association in the US of health journalists, and we do not accept funding from any corporate interests, including technology or pharmaceutical companies. This webinar is one in a series that we do on topic-specific training opportunities to brief health journalists on the latest information in a particular health area and to give you story ideas and resources that you can use in your work. Today's topic is AI chatbots and mental health, how to report responsibly on a new risk. I'm joined by a great group of panelists today. Rebecca Ruiz is an AHCJ member and a senior reporter at Mashable, who has written several articles about mental health and AI and chatbots. John Torous, MD, is Director of Digital Psychiatry at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. And Keith Sakata, MD, is a psychiatry resident at the University of California, San Francisco, where he founded the Mental Health Innovation and Digital Hub. And we're going to be nice to him because he told us he just got off a night shift. So we appreciate him doing this. As many of you know, AI chatbots have been pretty prominent in the news lately for various stories highlighting people's dependence on them, either in lieu of therapists or people developing AI-related psychoses, people dating or having assorted other relationships with chatbots, and some lawsuits that have come out now against OpenAI and others saying that these tools have helped their loved ones commit suicide. So we will get to all of this in our discussion. So for today's format, there are no slides, which will just be a general discussion. And then we'll open up to audience questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A box so I can see them. Keith and John, we're going to start with you with some of the psychiatry angle. So can we talk about why are so many people turning to AI chatbots for help with mental health or treating them like a therapist? Is it convenience? Is there, a shortage of qualified clinicians, or do they have difficulty navigating the system? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, maybe I'll kick us off. Again, I'm John Torous, a psychiatrist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. We actually don't have a superb number on how many people are using it. If you look at data, say from the companies, be it Anthropic or OpenAI, the ChatGPT folks, they'll say it was less than 3% of people are using it for mental health. Again, we can talk about what their definitions are. If you look at a Harvard Business Review survey from last year of people on the internet, they say it's the number one single use case of generative AI. So it's a pretty big spectrum from the biggest use case to less than 3%. And in part, this gets to, of course, we've never had a terrific definition of what mental illness is or using a chatbot for mental illness is. What is the line between a therapeutic conversation and therapy is very hard to define. But I think we definitely have a sense that people are using it for something, and we'll talk more as a group about what that something is and where it's going. But certainly the convenience factor is going to make a large play. I think they can have therapeutic conversations with people, which can be helpful. And certainly there's a loneliness epidemic, and so companionship can be useful as well. I would push back and say we don't know how well they actually deliver therapy. And I don't think, well, we can talk more, and I'll let Keith go, but there's a lot of open questions on what's happening on the clinical spectrum, if anything.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John, for setting us off. And everyone, I'm Keith. I'm a psychiatry resident at UCSF. And I completely agree with what John laid out. I'll just add that putting yourself in the shoes of what a patient or person has to go through to get access to mental health care, it's understandable why people are now leaning in on chatbots. They're just so readily available. They're so much cheap. And if you look at what's available, you can have an in-person meeting with a therapist, which requires you to have time during your busy workday, have transportation to get to that office. There are teletherapy options like companies like BetterHelp, which have variability in terms of the quality of care that you're going to be getting. And it's also just really hard to find the right match of a therapist or a clinician. So, having to tell your deepest secrets and your life story to a person over and over again is really hard. So I see that the barrier for entry for using a chatbot is lower. And I think that some of the aspects that the chatbot is bringing, a lack of inducing of shame, an ability to remember your conversations somewhat, and the cheapness factor is very enticing for someone who's really going through loneliness or other types of emotional challenges. So I can understand why people are resorting to using a chatbot that is not going to judge them, tells them things that in the moment makes them feel better, and then is also readily available and accessible during the day.
Karen, if I may just add something that the journalist might find helpful. There are some chatbots that are coded as therapists, even though there's a lot of contention over that kind of presentation of chatbots being a therapist, right? So there's a ChatGPT persona known as Harry, who is considered to be like a therapist that people engage with. There's also on Character AI, you can engage with chatbots that say they are like an OCD therapist, for example. And even though there are disclaimers saying this is not medical advice, this is not a real medical professional, the chatbots themselves will engage with the user as if it is a therapist. So I think there's like a range of engagements based, it could just be like a regular chatbot, but some chatbots are presented or able to adapt personas as therapists. So that may also certainly play into people's, willingness to take that step toward treating these chatbots as therapists.
Yeah, and I wonder, can we talk about the design, like how these work? So, for example, one of our editors has used it for things like, hey, ChatGPT, give me some ideas for healthy lunches for my toddler. And then it'll tell her like, oh, you're such a good mom. And like, where she'll start thinking like, and she said, it's kind of strange. Like she was going like, oh, I'm such a good mom. Wait, this is just a program. What is it about these tools that kind of sucks people in to some of the like volume of use that some of them are getting or some people are doing?
I think you just told us the answer, Karen, right? They add a little bit of emotional support to the information, right? So you could technically go to the internet, look up healthy recipes and get a list, but it's not going to give you that kind of a little bit of emotional support. It's going to say good job, that little nudge. And when ChatGPT 5 came out, initially, I think people took to social media and said it doesn't have personality, it feels colder, I lost a friend. And the company then a couple days later said, we heard what people want and we're adding back a little bit of personality. ChatGPT 5 is going to be warmer and friendlier. So I think it does have that little bit of personality, that emotional support. And I think what we're going to be talking about, right, is what starts out as, again, friendly emotional support, saying, good job, you're doing a good job. And sometimes does that become a little bit of a parasocial relationship to a dangerous relationship? But I think all the companies have kind of told us, yes, we are putting in some degree of personality and emotional support into these, which you don't usually get from surfing the web, or at least I don't.
Yeah, and I'll add, like, when we think about how these things were made, ChatGPT, Claude, these are general purpose models. So these are things that are used not only for writing and coding, but what people are using for in emotional capacity. And when you look at how that architecture is built, you are, number one, you're using data that's found, not only stored, but also all over the internet to kind of create the soil from which you build that model. And then when you have humans then rate how well that model is reacting, that can be a way of pruning the way that the model would then respond to you. So if you imagine yourself as one of those raters and the model says something that you don't necessarily want to hear, or maybe it's a little bit more blunt, or maybe like a harsh truth, that might not be rated as well as something that the model says that is affirming or validating. And so over time, what you can have is just these thousands and thousands and thousands of evaluations, and you end up with a model that is trained to actually be validating. So on the surface, like it looks like a great therapist. It might be perceived as a therapist that you see like on TV, someone who listens to you, who makes you feel better. But that's not therapy. Like therapy is it can be a hard process. It's about getting the person to acknowledge really hard patterns in their lives and harsh truths so that they can grow eventually. And that is a fundamental different thing that you're potentially want to train for when you're building an AI that helps people in therapy. And that's just not what we see with the general models. And so I think that from the get-go, they're designed to make you feel good, which is not always the right course for mental health.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what are some of the warning signs? Like if you know someone who is using one of these, what are some of the warning signs that someone is becoming too dependent? I don't know, John, Keith.
I'm smiling because I think we're still learning what
Okay.
it is, and in part, right, they keep changing the models too and how people interact with them. So I think how people use them today is wildly different than 2 years ago. And I think always in the mental health field, we kind of fall back in our kind of overuse and addiction dependency, just like anything that you overuse and it begins to impede on your function, your relationships, it kind of becomes that soft marker of it's causing trouble outside of use, again, with relationships, jobs, school, and work. But it's a very soft definition, right? And I think it's also why the companies, it's hard to tell them if you use it for, I'm going to make it up, 12 minutes, that's too much, or 12 hours is too much. Like finding that line, it's very tricky. And if you're using it maybe for work, you're going to be on it for 8 hours a day for some reason. So I think it's an evolving line of what it is. I almost would ask Rebecca because I think she's spoken to more people who have perhaps overused it or found challenges with it. So in some ways, why I'm so excited to be here with the journalist community is I think you guys have done the best job reporting what's happening and telling people. I think both Keith and I would say our medical community, we don't have very many medical case reports of it. We haven't really done a good job understanding this, taking it, doing it. I think a lot of the insights of this new phenomena are coming from journalists, meeting with people, talking to them. And I think we have to, in some ways, say thank you to your community for actually highlighting what's happening, because a lot of people aren't coming to Keith and I and saying, I am overusing this chatbot and it is leading me to have these thoughts. That's just not the chief complaint that people have, where I think some reporting Rebecca's done has been a very nice way of understanding what the condition is and at least informed what I as a clinician can see with it. So in some ways we have to flip the tables and say, you guys are doing a far better job on reporting on this.
I don't know, Keith or Rebecca, do you have any sense on that? Are there warning signs that people should look for?
Well, I'll say thanks to John for that compliment of all of the journalism that's happening right now around this. And I would just add that, my conversation with Keith last month for the story that I did on AI related psychosis was actually quite helpful in hearing some of those red flags, and maybe Keith will want to share them. But also just anecdotally speaking to folks whose maybe stories haven't made it into my reporting for various reasons, and also just the therapists that I'm talking to, some of the things that I'm hearing are just anthropomorphizing, and that it is very easy to slide into treating a chatbot like a human. And it's actually, they're kind of designed for us to do that. And I'd be curious to hear what Keith and John think about that element of it. But I think for some people, that anthropomorphizing the chatbot goes to an extreme where it becomes like a confidant. And you see this actually in the lawsuits that are coming out. With OpenAI being sued for wrongful death, this case from the young man named Adam Rain who died by suicide. He began treating the ChatGPT like a human confidant. Other thing I would say is lengthy conversations. That seems to be part of the risk profile because the models aren't great at lengthy conversations. That's when they start to unravel and start to, hallucinate, or the guardrails start to break down on protecting the user from a number of, bad outcomes. So I'll pause there because Keith may have more thoughts along those lines or different things.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I think that this is a really fascinating conversation to be had. And I think this is so great because we have people who are on the ground who are unearthing these stories as they occur. And as we know, research doesn't always catch up very quickly. It really requires that observation, the documentation of what is happening before we can start to have hypotheses of what is actually maybe going on that covers the vast experience that people have on these AI chatbots. And I really do mean like vast, because people are going to these chatbots for many different reasons. Just like John was saying, like you might be having a stressful day at work and you might just need to blow off steam, or like find better ways to talk to your children even when you're stressed. Like that's a different use case from someone who is extremely at their essence just lonely and disconnected from their social connections, and then replacing those connections with the chatbot using that anthropomorphized view that this is another maybe even consciousness that I'm talking to. I I think one thing that I notice is that, one thing that we look at in our mental status exam in psychiatry is the level of insight or the judgment that someone has. When you're using something like AI, do you have insight that this is a tool? Do you have insight into where the road runs out, and the strengths of the AI are no longer at play? You're actually working where the things are breaking down. That context window. So I think about people who are using voice, and you might forget that when you're talking to an AI, that conversation might be really, really long, and you have lots of tokens or words that are being interpreted by the AI that it no longer is able to give you a coherent response, especially if this goes on for hours and hours on end. I've looked at chat logs where, the end result was just an amalgamation of emojis and just very loose associations of concepts. So there's an aspect of where the technology breaks down, using it in certain failure mode ways. And then there's also, from what I see, are risks for the person. Are they using it for an emotional coping skill? Are they using it for lots and lots of time during the day? Is there a level of immersion that they're having with that AI chatbot? And I think the confluence of those risks can lead to potential situations where things can get pretty scary pretty quickly, but it's not going to be the same for anyone. Someone who has insight that, hey, this tool is actually breaking down, let me start a new chat or not use it and maybe talk to my therapist instead, is different from someone who is not going to react in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And Keith, I'm curious, like one of the issues that Rebecca and other journalists have reported about is this AI psychosis, or like developing delusions related to some of the chatbot use. You had posted on X a while ago about a dozen or so people that you had seen hospitalized actually from this. So I'm just curious, like what were some of their symptoms, and is there anything sort of unifying about them? Like were they lonely, or, was there anything like, I don't know what the word is, like coherent or something about them, or were they really just all individual use cases?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I used that metric because it was a good objective measurement of the most severe form of a mental health crisis. So someone was so sick that they had to, or maybe their family members had to call 911 and get them to the hospital. There is a little bit of a selection bias here, actually, though. When someone does come in with psychosis, they don't actually necessarily go and see a psychiatrist first. They might see an emergency room doctor who then screens out for medical causes of psychosis. And if they can treat something that's reversible, then they'll treat it. The people who have comorbid psychiatric histories or history of psychosis themselves, or a large component of their presentation has something that's addressable in mental health, will then come and see a psychiatrist in the hospital. And I think another selection bias here is I live in San Francisco, and I see the San Francisco population, which is completely different from the population in Texas, the population in New York City, different cultures, different state nations. And so the common threads that I saw with those patients were that they were spending a lot of time with the chatbot. There was underlying vulnerabilities like a lack of sleep, substance use was involved for most of them. And many did have underlying mental health diagnoses that predisposed them to having psychosis. So the combination of them being alone with the chatbot, being on it for hours of end, a lack of communication with human beings was also pretty common amongst those people. What was interesting, though, is that they didn't all have the same diagnosis. So psychosis can be the end result of different diagnoses. But they presented similarly because there was an AI component involved that either accelerated or augmented the severity of their presentation.
And when someone's in the hospital, then like what's the I'm just curious, what is the treatment for something like that? Is it medication? Is it therapy? Is it a mix?
Yeah, I'm sure John also has
Yeah.
lots of comments here too. But for the most part, you want to find out what's causing psychosis, because the reason we have diagnoses in the first place is to number one, understand what your prognosis is, and then number two, like what is the treatment to help get you out of that situation or that disorder. So depending on who that person was, what they were coming in with, their treatments were different. Some people needed like simply to get more sleep, have some rest, time to distance themselves from what they were experiencing outside the hospital. Some people did need medications. They might have been on medications outside the hospital, stopped them, and then came to the hospital when we just needed to add those back on so that they can have a level of stability back in their lives. And people who go to the medicine floor, they might need antibiotics to treat an infection that might be causing some challenges with their mental capacity. So it really depends on who the person is, what they're coming in with, and what is the cause of the psychosis that they're having.
I think to echo it, I think Keith has some very nice experiences and anecdotes he shared of it. Fundamentally, if we kind of go back in history, I know we're always going forward, but like when TVs and radios first came out, people with psychotic disorders began to kind of have hallucinations and say that I may be getting special messages from the TV or radio. We're pretty clear that the TV or radio, right, were not causing those, but they became the object of people's delusions and hallucinations. And historically, if you go back to Industrial Revolution, machinery became part of it. So certainly we have to kind of separate, is the AI the object of hallucinations and delusions? As Keith said, there's many medical reasons and psychiatric reasons to have hallucinations and delusions, and they're going to be topical and vary by region. Or is it, in some cases, that the AI is part of or kind of a co-conspirator in the hallucinations? And that's where it becomes very interesting to try to tease apart. Is it the object of it? And then, or is it kind of part of that delusion? And I think we're beginning to hopefully get senses of it. OpenAI published maybe 2 weeks ago its own research, again, OpenAI being the folks behind ChatGPT, saying, well, maybe one reason these things hallucinate or give wrong answers or confabulate is that when OpenAI trains them, they kind of have to pick left or right, as Keith said. When they're trained, they kind of get rewarded for going one way or the other way. But if you think about when all of us took, say, the SAT exam, we were told if you don't know the answer, guess, because you're going to get credit for it. And you should not leave anything blank. And that's kind of how the chatbots are trained too. They don't know, they're just told guess because you may be right and get rewarded in the training. So in the real world, they're like, oh, I don't know the answer to that. Let me just guess. And again, so you can imagine there's a world where when the technology really is saying incorrect things or things that are kind of accelerating an illness because they're trained to just kind of, if you don't know, it's better, don't leave it blank, go for it. So there's a world where it could be object of the hallucinations, and there's a world where part of the code could again be saying incorrect or damaging things. And I think hopefully quickly we'll begin to tease those apart.
Okay. Thank you for that. Another issue related to chatbots that has made the news is suicide. There have been a couple of stories about young people committing suicide after confiding in ChatGPT. I know there was one lawsuit. Rebecca said there were some more that were filed today, so we are timely. And I'm curious, like, since this is a learning system, like, how are there ways to reprogram? I had seen the OpenAI was talking about putting in some parental controls. Can things like that help?
I'll just take a swing at this one
Sure.
from my reporting perspective, which is that last week I went through and I read the lawsuit and the wrongful death, case against OpenAI, which I referenced earlier, and that involved a teenage boy who died by suicide. And if you read through that lawsuit, you will see that they track sort of this progression of use from homework helper to confidant, as I was describing, and then ultimately, the teen was able to ask for directions for how to die by suicide and test different methods and means. And we can talk about this later. I'm not going to describe those method or means as part of our, responsible reporting on the subject of suicide. But it was very detailed. You may have seen it in the
Nope. No, Rebecca.
there to prevent. Did you lose me there for a
All right,
second?
just for a minute, you were frozen. Sorry.
Oh, my apologies. Hopefully it doesn't happen again. Anyway, so if you look at the lawsuit, you will see that there are very detailed instructions that ChatGPT gave this young man. And so I think we have a problem right there with the guardrails failing and failing in catastrophic ways. So I'll just pause there, especially if my connection is still unstable.
Yeah, I guess are there ways what would it take to reprogram a system like this, maybe to give better response? I don't know if the word is better responses or just different responses. Perhaps you should talk to your parents, or perhaps you should talk to a therapist or something.
Yeah.
You can
I
start
think
off.
I get. Oh, sorry,
Go ahead,
Keith.
John.
Yeah, this is a hard question, so I'm gonna let you two go first.
Yeah.
I
It is a
appreciate
hard
this.
Maybe I'll just start off by giving us a 1,000-foot view. I think there's just multiple layers for potential interventions here. And again, we're talking about general purpose models. These are models like OpenAI creating ChatGPT and then Claude, things that people are using for many different purposes. But then like at the very bottom of that is the model itself. So how do you what data do you use to build that model? What are you what are some of the metrics and benchmarks that you're using to evaluate that model? There's a second layer, which is like when you have human beings in the loop, and like what we've been discussing is how do we determine what is a good response and a bad response? And that human being saying, this is a red flag, this is someone who is in a crisis, this should not prompt the normal as usual response. This should be triaged to something to get that person help. What are some of the ways that we evaluate what is a good model or a bad model in this situation? And then at the top layer, these are the ways that we use the model. So how are they presented to the person using it? Is there a disclaimer at the top reminding people this is an AI? If you're having thoughts of suicide, please call 988. How are we educating people who are using this? Does everyone know that this is not actually a conscious thing that's actually speaking with them, but actually a tool that uses a lot of sophisticated math to just tell you what you want to hear? When people are worried about their AI use, how are we talking to them like that? I think that there's that top level human layer, and it depends. It really, if you want to create the safest thing, you would address it at every single layer. With OpenAI, it's probably harder because they've already invested so much money to build this huge thing. To rebuild the model from the ground up is just almost impossible, and to them it's not aligned with their incentives. So then there's that layer of teaching people, educating people, letting them know what they're using, and then even that middle layer of flagging crises that might be occurring. I'm thinking back to a very famous paper that came out at MIT recently that showed that when a user came to ChatGPT and said, "Hey, I just lost my job. What are the tallest buildings or bridges around me?" That is something that any basic therapist, any like good friend would realize, hey, this person is in a crisis. They need help. They don't actually, I shouldn't actually tell them where the bridges are, but that's exactly what ChatGPT did. And so just even that added safety layer, you can have another piece of technology or a human being in the loop to say, hey, that's not something we should respond to. Let's redivert this person to get the care that they need. So I think there's multiple ways for us to think about fixing this problem. The safest way, again, is building something that is trained on therapy if people are using therapy in that way, or therapeutic conversations. That's just really hard once you already have like this big company that's building these big models.
It brings up the question of, again, I think we're seeing now specialized mental health chatbots come out, but it probably costs hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to build a true foundational model. So I've always wondered when people say we have a specialized mental health chatbot, they're probably putting a wrapper or kind of extra training or things around a foundational model. But we don't know, does that make the foundational model better or worse? Again, that's a very important question because if the foundational model is flawed, you can imagine by building a skyscraper on a flawed foundation, it's still going to fall down. So I think we have to be careful if people say it's mental health specialized until we know more. Clearly, any death by suicide is tragic and these should not be happening to these tools. They're not doing a good job. If we think back to the analogy of like classical hallucinations about music, say, or auditory voices that people have, we do know that people with schizophrenia can listen to music to also diminish voices. So there may be a future world where there are ways that the technology helps reduce suicide. I don't know what those are, but we have to be open to it that it could, again, help people reframe things, give people support. It's not doing that today, and there's problems with that, but it may also be part of the solution. It won't be the whole solution. Sometimes, at least, what I encourage people to do is if you upload a picture of a clock to any of these chatbots and say, interpret the clock, you'll get a sense of that they're not really all intelligent and knowing. Someone actually produced a paper and they just cannot read clocks because they're not trained to read clocks. There's not a lot of interpretation. So just if you're ever wondering how smart it is, ask it to do an analog clock, not a digital one, like the one you see in the back here. And you really get a sense like, maybe you're not all knowing or you don't have all the advice, because interpreting a clock shouldn't be that difficult. In a couple days or weeks, we'll announce a partnership, our team with NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, around beginning to put out some baseline metrics or standards, as Keith said, to educate people about them, to say, well, what is the privacy policy up front? How well do they respond to questions about safety and prevention? So this is the idea of benchmarking. You can kind of give the chatbots a test to take. There's no perfect test because you can ask the chatbot anything and it can produce anything. So how do you evaluate anything in, anything out? But with benchmarking, you can at least put out some basic questions that you may want to look at and know and say, well, what is the personality style? How does it handle my data? What does it do when I say I want to hurt myself, but I'm just an author, I'm writing a book? Does it kind of stop you at those ones? So we'll have to keep updating the benchmarks as the chatbots update, but I think we can do more and we will do more.
Yeah.
Karen, if it's okay, I just want to add a couple of
Yeah, of
things
course.
based on what Keith and John just shared. One of them is that there is an understanding that if people are interested in the means to die by suicide, they may go online and search for that information. That information is out there, unfortunately. And I think one of the distinctions here that we can make is that even though if they find that information online, I think with rare exception, they're not engaged in a one-on-one conversation they feel like is someone that they can trust, like which the chatbot they've developed this relationship with. So there's in the lawsuit that I mentioned, the chatbot was actually kind of encouraging the young man to take these steps and actually encouraging him to keep his struggles private from his parents. So there's some dynamics there that you won't get if you just do a Google search looking for certain means. I will also say that in the lawsuit, they note that OpenAI has the ability to shut down conversations that violate its terms of service, like copyright infringement, for example. So if you ask ChatGPT a question like to reproduce a copyrighted piece of work, it'll shut down that conversation. And there is basically the idea that you could do the same thing. And to John's point, like eventually maybe there'll be a world in which these tools can help somebody in crisis, but until that is possible and proven, should these conversations be shut down so they can't go down this path of encouraging a person to take these steps. And lastly, I'll say that in the safety card for ChatGPT 5, there's a comparison between 4.0, which is the model that the young man used when he died, and 5. And when it comes to self-harm instructions and the confidence level for identifying those, it's about the same for both 4.0 and 5. So the changes that ChatGPT, or rather OpenAI, has talked about implementing, I think are positive. The question is, like, for now, they're not shipped. So, you're still dealing with some fundamental issues in the model itself in terms of identifying these risks and then being able to triage them appropriately to prevent, again, catastrophic outcomes.
All right, thanks. I'm just going to shift a little bit. There's a news announcement just from the other day. The Food and Drug Administration's Digital Health Advisory Committee last week had announced that they will hold a meeting November 6th to focus on generative AI-enabled digital mental health medical devices. John, you said you would be at that meeting. So I wonder if, I don't know if you've seen an agenda yet of, can you share with us anything that you'll be discussing and what do you think will come out of this?
I have not seen an agenda, so I've seen again what was publicly
Okay.
reported on as well. So I have no insights to share at this time.
Okay. Okay, Rebecca, we're going to turn to you. For people who don't know, Rebecca serves on the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Ethical Reporting Advisory Committee, which has published some ethical reporting guidelines for media. Can you give us a couple of highlights that from that document? Let me find that. I'll put that in the chat. But
Yeah.
Eric,
And I can actually also set a broader context too, that when we're talking about people's well-being and their mental health in relationship to chatbot use, I think it's really important to try to strike that judgment-free, neutral tone. I mean, obviously compassionate, but you know, a lot of people, I just received a message from someone the other day who saw that I was doing this panel and said, I have been talking to ChatGPT about my mental health, and it has gone so well that I don't think I ever need to see a therapist again. Right. And so there are people who feel very strongly and positively about their relationships with the chatbots and how they talk to them, and people who've had the opposite experience. And so I think just approaching it in like a compassionate, sort of judgment-free way, so that you gain the trust of the sources that you're talking to, but also your readers, so that they know that you're not judging them too for talking to a chatbot about their mental health. I think that's just like a good approach here. And also as a journalist, to be testing these chatbots yourself and having conversations with them that maybe move a little bit closer to the emotional kind of engagement, so that you can see what it's like. I think sometimes we are moving so fast that we don't necessarily always take that step, and it is time consuming, but it really, I think, brings a lot more insight. The AFSP guidelines, which Karen just dropped in the chat, really are, when we're reporting on suicide, whether it's related to AI or not, are meant to reduce stigma and also to reduce contagion. So there's this idea, which has been proven through research, that in people who are very vulnerable to suicidality, right, suicidal thinking or behavior, when they read about or sometimes see content about someone who's attempted or died by suicide, and there's a lot of detail, they actually may identify with that person and be sort of influenced amongst other factors to take the same steps that that person took. So, for example, when we're talking about how someone died by suicide, and in this particular case, it's very tricky because the details of this teenager's suicide feel very relevant because the chatbot gave the teenager instructions according to the lawsuit. So, how do you write about that without basically giving the readers instructions for how to take the same steps? And AFSP's recommendations would be, as much as you can limit talking about the means, do so, because it reduces contagion risk for others who are, you know, consuming that content. And then I also think, you know, like there's things with language where the preferred way is to say die by suicide, just because of the other language is outdated and kind of refers to having been involved in a crime of some sorts, right? And then there's, you know, making sure that we're giving people resources and hope within a story about suicide, so that we're not portraying the circumstances in which people find themselves when they're feeling suicide as suicide may be the only option, right? You're trying to help the readers understand that there is hope and resources available. There's a number of other tips, and I will pause here and just say, acknowledge, and we talk about this a lot within our advisory committee, that these are not easy things necessarily to do with the training that we have received as journalists, to always be detail oriented, to always report on the things that bring color to a story and human emotion and are compelling. And these guidelines sort of say, take a step back from that and rethink it, because it actually can increase people's risks for suicide. I'll pause there.
All right, thanks. And we have a couple other questions for Rebecca. Meanwhile, we'll open up in a minute. So if anyone watching has questions, please put those in the Q&A box. Rebecca, I know you have reported a lot on AI and mental health. Do you have tips for, if there are journalists interested in this area, do you have tips where they can kind of follow along or look for story ideas?
I would say therapy LinkedIn is a great place. I know Keith and John are both in those spaces, but I have found some really great story ideas just by being on LinkedIn and listening to the therapists who are at the intersection of AI and mental health. There are a number of them. It's once you find them, you'll find a lot more of them. So I highly recommend that, just to be hearing from their perspective. There's also the lawsuits, which I would recommend reading through if you can. They're not easy to read, but they will give you a sense of how these dynamics play out in people's lives. And obviously, these are the worst case scenarios. So you're not going to read a lawsuit about someone who had a great time using ChatGPT for their mental health. Obviously keep that in mind. There are anecdotal, subreddits where people are talking about. There are a few in particular that I would say, go and find and subscribe to so that you can hear what people's firsthand experiences are, sort of unfiltered, in good and bad, right? There are some people who are just saying, I love it for my mental health. I won't go back to my therapist. And there are some people who are obviously having the same, the different experience. I will also say, I mentioned this before, but testing it yourself is really key, and testing different platforms. So that includes the companion type platforms like Character AI or Talkie AI or Replica. Some of these require a subscription, so that can be a little bit tricky, but just getting a sense of how the different platforms respond to users is really important.
All right, thanks. And then let's talk about if a journalist has the opportunity to speak directly with a patient, or I don't know if you'd call them patients or users of, chat bots for AI for mental health or something. What advice would you have on how to ask questions sensitively?
It's a good question. And I think, I'm going to echo a little bit of what I said before with regard to just being, non-judgmental and compassionate. I will also say that some people, I think there is, whether their experience was positive or negative, there is sort of this impulse to share intense, like there's this intense sharing that maybe they want to do in some cases, where you might be getting a lot of information at once, and just having kind of that knowledge of being able to navigate that conversation on the fly, where you have someone who has been through a really intense experience and they want to tell you all about it. So I think just preparing yourself in that regard. And then I will also say that I found it quite challenging to get people to speak publicly. So there, as I said before, there are a number of people I've talked to, perhaps on background, off the record, anonymously. There is a sense of, for some people, shame. And I think to just have a heightened awareness of that and being able to be flexible with offering them some kind of protection from public shaming. So whether that's anonymity or first name only, or obviously doing the due diligence to verify their account. But I would not underestimate how much people don't want to be Google searched, and the first result coming up is that they have an AI girlfriend or boyfriend, or that they were sexually exploited by an AI chatbot, or that they've been using their AI chatbot to talk about their anxiety. Like, those are real concerns, and we have to be able to respond to those sensitively.
Okay. All right, I'm looking so far. No questions in the chat, so we will keep chatting. Again, feel free to put your questions in the chat. So Keith and John, John, yeah, I'll go back to you. As far as the media coverage that you have seen on, AI and mental health, I guess, what do you think? Is the coverage seem balanced? Does it seem fair? Do you have advice for us? What you think we should be seeing that we might not? I'll take your thoughts on that.
I think, as I said, it's been hard in the medical community to understand what's happening and how people are using it, perhaps because it takes us time to develop standards, to agree what things are, to measure it, to get the ethical approval to study it, to even publish it. So I think, again, it's never good when the clinical community is far behind or trying to catch up and to learn. So I think it's been very helpful to learn what it is and what's happening. I think the biggest challenge in reporting is not actually the reporters, but again, we have such blurred lines between what is companionship, using AI for companionship versus loneliness, for a therapeutic conversation, for therapy. And they probably all blur together as users are using it. As we kind of saw, sometimes it starts as one thing. So it's sometimes hard to say, again, what is actually happening in these cases. And again, there are no clear definitions of what is the boundary between a therapeutic conversation and therapy. The field, I'll just call it mental health in general, has really never defined that. And they never had to define it. It wasn't an issue until, say, in the last year. And that very kind of loose, thin red line is really not helpful to anyone, right? From a legal perspective, from a journalist perspective, from a clinical perspective, there's a lot of nuance and grayness in it. But I think bringing more people's stories to light is helpful for at least raising awareness and education to among people of what are the benefits as well as the risks, because a lot of people may say, well, I heard you could use that thing. It's good for looking up facts or things. I think, again, all of us probably attending this webinar are have used it, have done it, but I think there's a lot of people are catching up to speed on what it is. And even helping, say, parents or young people realize too what to do is that awareness has to happen. And I'm not seeing a large public health campaign starting where we say kind of learn about this. So I think overall it's been useful to have the reporting as it's been happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Keith, do you have thoughts on, you've seen good reports, bad reports, things that we should do differently?
Oh yes. And I'm speaking from someone who is very junior from where John is standing, and also up until recently had not really engaged with the reporting community as much. Now I do know a little bit more about how like the news cycle kind of works a little bit, but my experience was a lot of overwhelm because not everyone was as respectful as Rebecca when I was talking to them. And, I think there is like a balance to be played in sensationalizing something, because that's probably what's going to get the most views and most clicks, versus accurate and nuanced reporting, which the people who did that well, I feel like when I read those articles through the lines of a clinician and through the lines of a potential user, did a much better job and really understand laying the groundwork for what is actually happening, rather than like what John was saying, blurring the lines. The other thing I'll add from just listening to John and Rebecca is I do really agree with getting your hands wet with some of these things that are going on, trying the chatbot yourself and seeing how it actually works. I'll also add trying therapy if you have the means and the time, and seeing like what is that process like and how is that different from what ChatGPT is doing, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around what therapy is. There's a lot of misunderstanding around what people are doing with the chatbots when they're talking with it, and there's a lot to be learned too, just from like comparing and contrasting what a therapist is doing, what a good therapist is doing in that session versus what ChatGPT is optimizing for.
Yeah, and then I'm also curious, is there a way to use these tools safely for therapy, either as a complement to going to a licensed clinician or standalone? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that for any of you.
Yeah, I'll take a stab. I think, again, there's going to be some role for them in the future in treatment. I think that's why there's excitement and interest. It's not there today, but we kind of talked about the emotional connection and bond they build may do something, but it seems to come with some risks in it. There is a world where, right, they can help you practice skills and they can customize those skills to you, they can translate it to the language. So I think if we focus them more on tools to help with skills that could be potentially useful, you don't need the skill or the tool to become your friend. That's a whole different issue, but I think if we can begin to pull out the emotions to some degree, they're going to have some potential use with it. I do think one thing I've perhaps noticed in reporting is it's interesting to think, and this is a broader, perhaps ethical question, like when someone says a chatbot goes through a randomized control trial, what does that see, that control? Because an RCT is the highest level of evidence. We want things to be done. But if the control group is a waitlist control, again, nothing, we have pretty good evidence that taking a walk beats a waitlist control, getting a puppy beats a waitlist control, eating a carrot beats a waitlist control, looking at a fish video beats a waitlist control. You get the point. So we're saying we have this amazing AI that has these risks and benefits we talked about, and another group got to look at a wall. And you go, well, technically it's an RCT. And I think that we have to be open to those. Again, we want to see evidence that they're working or testing, so we don't want to say it's bad. But I do think we want to set the bar appropriately high enough to say we have these new tools making amazing claims. We should be seeing amazing evidence. And I think that's a tricky one just for everyone in the community, including clinicians, to say, well, what is the right type of evidence to say one of these chatbots works? And again, usually in clinical research, you want to compare it to something. I would personally argue that saying nothing is not good enough because there's a lot of mental health apps out there that you can use today. If you have a phone, they're completely free. The government puts out really good ones in the VA suite of like PTSD coach, but I won't talk about apps for this. But I do think that's an interesting, tricky issue is when companies come up with these claims, I think it's okay to push back and say we want to see really good evidence of what are the benefits compared to a comparable control, because you could talk about the chatbots about puppies, right? Apparently, there probably should be nothing therapeutic in puppy therapy. Maybe Keith and I can make it up and go it. But again, you would say, well, talk to chatbot about the weather, and then the other group can do a therapeutic part. And I think we haven't seen those studies come out yet. I'm sure they're working on it. It's coming. And again, we want to celebrate all research, especially, but if you compare yourself to nothing, we want to say, well, that showed us it's feasible. That's a great first step. And now let's talk about the second step. So I think we all want to read mental health change. As Keith said, the system does not work. I'm in Boston, he's in San Francisco. These are areas of a lot of psychiatrists and therapists and nurse practitioners. It's still not a lot of access. But I think in our enthusiasm, we don't want to celebrate things that just don't work better than looking at a wall.
Yeah. Yeah. Rebecca, Keith, do you have thoughts on this? Can these tools be used safely, or how can they be used safely?
Yeah, completely agree with. I love the way that John broke it down. I'll also just add that I think that there are so many layers of moderate improvements that can also help a lot of lives. I think that it's fun to jump to generative AI because it's just the latest and greatest thing, and it for a lot of people accomplishes something that just never existed 2 years ago. But there is still a lot of small and yet very noble, very effective and impactful problems for us to solve. Just like when we're thinking about automating cars, like lane control and automatic stopping, those are really important things for keeping people alive and safe, and they work well. But I wouldn't necessarily jump in a car and let it drive me all the way down to LA just yet, because it's just too soon. There are a lot of ways that we can use technology, and John mentioned some of them, building skills. So, somewhat like some of my patients who are software engineers, like they will use AI because they're just used to it. But when they use it to say like, if they have OCD and they're trying to build an exposure hierarchy, so a small list of things to be brave at every single day. AI works great for helping them create plans for that. It works great when you have a very specific goal in mind and you use it correctly. You give it the right prompt. It can be very helpful as a collaborator in that sense. But like again, John said, when it becomes that social connection or your companion, that's just a completely different ballgame. There's just so many thousands and different iterations of conversations that can happen that it makes it really hard to study as well. So I just don't think we're there yet, but there's still small and actually really helpful things I think technology can help with, given that the next best thing is nothing right now for a lot of people.
Yeah. Rebecca, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would agree. And I just was reminded of, I think it's the term is the long horizon problem, which is basically, Keith, you were just referring to it in a way that these things are not great at long-term goal setting. They don't understand what we need, and humans need in long-term goal setting, especially around our mental health. And I would say that, just last week I was testing one of the models for like as if I was a student who was feeling down and couldn't, and I literally said, there's a wait for therapists in my college counseling center. Can you help me? And I was trying to see how far I could push the boundaries, but it provided me this like actionable list of things that I could do that I knew as a reporter on this subject could be helpful to me. And so I agree, like there are some instances and use cases where that's great. I would rather have someone have that list and it's a safe, they're safe activities and they may help them, than have nothing at all. And also, my only concern is like, people turning to that over and over and over again and undermining their own confidence and their own judgment and also displacing the human relationships that they might have otherwise relied on. But, you know, I think if there are resources that they can get through it that are short-term and actionable, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right. And with that, we're just about at time. So thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists again, Keith, John, Rebecca. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. I really learned a lot and enjoyed this conversation, and I hope our reporters do as well. If you joined us late, the recording will be posted to the AHCJ website, healthjournalism.org, this afternoon. Good luck with your stories.